All right. So let's start with the longevity movement,
Mhm.
which is something we have discussed on this
Mhm.
podcast before. I actually read. Have you read Stephen Batchelor at
No.
all?
Uh-uh.
He's a sort of a Buddhist thinker and teacher. I interviewed him yesterday for this podcast, but
Cool.
he wrote something that made me think of the longevity movement. He wrote, "We realize that the only certainty in life is that it will end. We don't like the idea. We try to forget that too. Everyone collaborates and everyone else is forgetting. Parents seek to prepare their offspring for life. Social and political institutions are there to benefit the living, not the dead. Religions largely offer consolation. Perhaps there's a chance that we won't really die after all." And he wrote this
Mhm.
back in, I think, the 1980s or 1990s. You can add to that now Silicon Valley trying to solve death. But
Right
I just
on.
thought that I thought that line, "everyone collaborates and everyone else is forgetting," is a really interesting one. Um, and this idea that we really don't like to think about the fact that it's going to all end.
Right.
What do you make of this attempt that we have to try to extend our lifespan at the most generous interpretation and at the least generous to solve death, if you will?
Mm. That quote from Mr. Batchelor is a beautiful one. Yeah, from the 1980s, perhaps, but he could have written that in the, 1080s. This is sort of a timeless thing. We keep, my sense is, if I understand humans and human history a little bit, I don't think this is new, this sort of idea of wanting to live longer, which then kind of dovetails into a flight from death, and that's where some of the trouble can come. You're running away from a big piece of reality. Also, I mean, I don't want to pathologize the pathologizers. Again, this is normal. We are wired to run away from anything that fight or flight mechanisms, fight it or run or freeze from anything that has a threat to our existence. So I want to start by normalizing that. So the quest to live longer, great. Hey, I'm all for it. You know, Being interested in death is very much the same thing as being interested in life, not the opposite. Sort of a less versed opinion would have, and I get this sometimes in my work as a hospice doctor, you know, sort of ghoulishly, oh, you love death, oh, therefore you're against life. You want everyone to die or something. Well, no, no, Jesus, no. My point and many, many others is simply like, hey, I'm interested in reality. I'm interested in my life, and my life happens to include this thing called death, as it has for every other living creature ever, ever, ever. So, might as well work with it, more. So I'm death neutral more than death positive. It just happens to be a thing. So let's work with it.
So you have fight, flight, or freeze, right?
Yeah.
What would be, what do you think's our fourth option we should use when it comes to death? Just accept, embrace? What's the verb you use there?
Well, good question, man. So some folks would say, by the way, that there's a fourth one I learned recently called fawning. That sometimes we'll identify with the thing that's a threat to us and try to kind of reverse the psychology and reflexively kind of compliment it or praise it as though that might upend what feels like a cruelty. So there's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn is what I've
Hmm.
is interesting, an interesting fourth. But I don't think that quite gets at your question. I mean, I think another way off that automatic kind of reflexive nervous system loop is like anything that is fearful. If you hang around through the fear, there's often this beautiful valley on the backside of it. So, facing that fear, daring to stick around to deal with it, look at it, even if you're terrified, very often pays huge dividends. So, like so many things, as in this life, you kind of want to, yes, understand your reflexive response, but often stick around to see what's behind it or what's beyond it. And so, yes, back to your question, buddy. I think maybe a fifth word would be acceptance. And let's be clear, acceptance is not a passive state, doesn't mean rolling over, doesn't mean, somehow identifying with anything that you think is a threat to you. Acceptance in my book is simply seeing the world as it is. You can still be angry at it or afraid of it. You get to have your emotions. This is not emotional engineering. I think is a huge mistake we make, trying to ram our feelings around rather than hear them, follow them, listen to them, tell them what I see what they're teaching us. So yes, I think a great word here would be acceptance, as long as we have a pretty full understanding of what acceptance means.
Yeah, acceptance is not necessarily resignation.
Exactly, or quitting, or whatever we want to negatively valence it with. Yes, exactly.
And so, can you speak to some of the changes that you saw in your or have seen in your own life once you start to bring death a little bit more to the forefront? Once
Hmm.
you stop avoiding it?
Yeah. What I think it does is if you turn your attention to this thing that we're all kind of in collusion to in flight from, is which would have you think it's this exotic foreign force lurking behind a tree somewhere is going to jump out and grab you or something, like some grim reapery thing. Well, as you start paying attention, you see it's everywhere. You know, bugs on your windshield, leaves falling from trees, whatever. In people's lives, your own life, people you've known. Much more interestingly, as you start getting into it, besides sort of an obvious sort of death, you start asking, well, what the hell is death? I don't know. All I can say is it's a big change, a big transformation of some kind. I don't know. I can't say more than that. And so if you start seeing it as change or a loss of some kind, well, geez, death as a metaphor is everywhere. Like the
Hmm.
death of the death of some memories that I'm losing my memories, or the death of an idea, or the death of a relationship, all sorts of deaths that we're dealing with all the time. So one answer to your question is you start seeing how thorough and how common death is, and
Hmm.
how familiar. So right out of the chutes, we've already kind of gone from this scary boogeyman thing to, oh, wait a second, this is something I actually know a little something about. So that by itself, I've just expanded my sense of reality. I've just kind of keyed into that maybe inherent to my being is maybe I know something here. Maybe this isn't so exotic. So that I find a relief right there. That dampens my fears. So that's a huge piece. Another thing that kind of I think is waiting for us if we dare to turn our attention is given that universal nature of it, it is can be a source of connection to every living critter. But if you hang in there, again, you're going to see this thing of how we all are related to each other, how we are all connected in this endeavor. And then all of a sudden you've got a lot in common with everybody. It's a real antidote to loneliness, which is, of course, a scourge right now, but disconnection. So this can be a real connecting force. Huge. Lastly, I mean, there's many, I think we could talk for
Yeah.
hours on this, but I'll just say for now, anyway, one more thing is kind of related to this sort of interdependence, but you get to feel the grace of giving and receiving. We are vulnerable, period. Period. You can layer up the defenses, you can put on armor, you can do it, but you are vulnerable. I mean, we all probably know people who were, I just saw Bill this morning and pluck, Bill's just gone. It
Hmm.
just, that is the natural state. That is not a weakness. That is a natural state. So you start feeling, you can start upend some of these notions of acceptance or strength or vulnerability, start seeing them as common, start feeling some compassion for yourself, or start feeling compassion for others who have to deal with the same plight. Before you know it, not only are you connected, but you're feeling for each other and yourself.
So there's avoiding confronting death. Then there is what we're talking about, which is sort of the acceptance or facing of it. Um, but it's still an abstraction in the sense of you like, knock on wood. But you and
Mhm.
I both are currently dying, but we are not terminally ill with anything right now. And then you work with many people who are like facing the sort of the end a bit more concretely because they've been given diagnosis that will only end in death. When people obviously, this is asking you to make a generalization when it's very individual and case by case, but when people learn that their end is closer than they thought, are there certain is there a certain are there commonalities in terms of the things they let go of or how they like someone who knows it a little bit less abstractly and a little bit more concretely, are there certain things that you find they unburden themselves of that maybe
Hmm.
people who know it like us know it a little bit more accepting of it, but still know it abstractly could
Mhm.
learn from that? Does that make sense? Like, what are the
It
things at the end of
does.
the life that people are like, I wish I hadn't spent so much time worrying about that, essentially.
Yes. Well, yeah, boy, it's a good question. There's probably a lot. Boy, yeah, I remember now, Clay. You ask good questions, and it's hard to stop talking to you with you. So, okay, so yes, and you first of all, you pointed out some more wisdom you're casually spewing here, which is that there's a continuum. This notion is inherently abstract. Yeah, we know we die. Yeah, we can metaphor our ways to something close to it. And we have to keep on. I think it's very important to keep, as much as we might turn our attention to it and get to know it, etc. We need to hold out the possibility that when I'm actually at the doorstep of my own the death of this body, this person, BJ, I don't know, man, I might absolutely lose my shit. In fact, I would welcome that, and because that is real. I'm increasingly I just want something. Give me something real. So, I just hold out the possibility that I will lose it. And that just points to your question. This is it's sort of a continuum. It's an abstraction when we're in the prime of life. Death is this thing that happens to other people. In fact, that's been studied. Our consciousness, well, I should say our egos, really struggle to grasp the fact that we die, that I die.
Mhm.
My ego really struggles with the fact that BJ dies. It
Yeah,
doesn't
not me.
focus so
Not
much.
happening to me.
Exactly. So here too, I think is another really important point. Maybe one answer to your question is, I think with a little love and support, with some often pain or symptom management to turn down some of the noise, I think what a lot of people go through when they get that diagnosis, or in other words, they've just met the thing that's actually going to end their life or bring about the end of their life someday. More and more of us live with chronic illness, and it might be months or years from your time of diagnosis to your death. But that time of diagnosis it just got realer. You've just
Mhm.
met the thing that's going to usher you out. That's another degree of familiarity and closeness and less abstraction. But again, it's on a continuum. So even those folks who are dealing with the diagnosis, they're still in some amount of metaphor with this. So I just want to kind of set that table a little bit. And when one thing that you might commonly see, again, with some encouragement, coaching, or if they just happen to be a sort of a student of life, they'll have seen it already, which is distinguishing their ego or their identity. I am BJ. I am a doctor. Okay, I get a lot of power and credit for that. I do, it's given me purpose. But what happens when I can no longer practice medicine? I will have lost now who am I? That happens a lot with a diagnosis. It tweaks your identity, is a threat to your ego, that part of yourself, which is an important part of yourself, but it's not the whole ticket. So I think what can happen with some love is people start turning their attention beyond themselves in a very narrow way, or see themselves as part of this larger thing that, yeah, I'm going to go as BJ, but my body as a source of energy will melt to the earth. It supports other life. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. This energy infusing my body will go on elsewhere. That's not a belief system, that unless you consider science a belief system. I mean, that is observable. So you start getting in touch with these more philosophical or spiritual places or points of connection, that are beyond yourself but include yourself. And so the taming of the ego a little bit can happen, or not. Or people can just double down and get even more freaked out and clutch to life. So that's why I say with loving support and some symptom management to kind of start really working with these realities. It can be a sort of a crossroads. People can sort of expand even as their body is declining, or they can follow their body and just go down.
Yeah, that's the identity bit is something I wanted to ask you about because I think we talk a lot about identity and the ways it can benefit you and the ways it can hold you back if you become too closely attached to
Yeah.
one part of yourself. And then, as you're saying, like if you identify as a doctor and you can no longer practice medicine and that is your entire identity is wrapped up in that, it's very jarring, I would imagine.
Yeah. Yeah.
When when your accident happened, I mean, I imagine you had to learn to put it lightly, you had to learn to accept a whole new identity in terms of things you could no longer do. You
Mhm.
lost actual physical parts of yourself.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, now looking back, it was a long time ago, but I'm just curious what that process was like of like letting go of those parts of your identity. And then also at the same time, when we spoke the first time, we spoke a little bit about how you were saying how it would be very easy to get lost in self-pity and identifying too much with self-pity. And so I'm just curious how you did that dance of like learning to let go of parts of your identity and also not identify with other parts of your
Mm.
identity that could hold you back. Because I think in some ways,
Yeah.
obviously, your situation is very individual to you, but
Yeah.
we all have these things where we're trying to let go of certain parts of our identity we have to move on from because we're getting older or our life changes, and there are other things we're not trying to identify with because they hold us back. And so I think everyone can relate to that.
Yep. It's great. It's a great point. And it also reminds me of your last question, which is this degree of abstraction. Like right now, the idea of letting go, like a lot of us might pursue contemplative practices, meditation, where you kind of learn the art of letting go, perhaps,
Hmm.
Taoism. There are all sorts of ways to help us learn to let go. That kind of implies that when there's a choice, like you
Yeah.
can let go or not. One of the things that happens with diagnoses, or for me when I had my injuries and lost a bunch, lost some body parts, as you say, like letting go, it helped that it wasn't a choice. Is my
Yeah.
point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just oh, there that goes.
Yeah.
And so there's another. This gets at your abstraction reality
Hmm.
question. It can be this very vaunted place. This I've learned to let go, and that can be beautiful. I would suggest we all cultivate that capacity. And if you do nothing, don't worry, life will take itself from you too. You will just, and so then you're left to kind of fool yourself and deny what's actually happening, or say, oh shit, well, this isn't what I had in mind, but here I am. And in that process, Clay, this gets at the second half of your question, I think, is you say, oh shit, that I am BJ, I am whatever. When I got injured, I was in college. I am a sophomore. I row crew. I am blah blah blah. Oh, there goes that. Okay, and I'm still here. Oh shit, I see now that this identity thing, this thing that helped me understand who I was, or project myself into the world, or somehow be known to myself or knowable, that identity stuff is totally made up or maybe largely made up. I mean, there's certain things where we inherit, etc., are foisted on us. But for the most part, that I am this or that, insert any adjective, those, while can feel incredibly real, and in some ways they are creations. And so once you see that identity is a made up phenomenon, well, for my money, this is where that's great news in a way, because now that I don't know who the hell I am, I can start again. I can recreate. I can build a new identity. I can become, I know I wasn't headed for medicine. I went from I'm BJ, the, guy rowing crew who doesn't know what he wants to do. So now I'm BJ, I'm going to go into medicine. That was entirely because of my experiences as a patient. And that was just a case in point of, once you see, and it may be a hard moment, you may need to grieve it when you see how flimsy identity is. The upshot is you can remake it. You can start again. You can recreate. You can reinvent yourself a zillion times. In fact, I suggest you do. That's one great way to prepare for death, if you ask me. So therein is both the sad, hard news and sort of the great news.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't planning on going here, but I wanted to talk to someone on the podcast about grief for a while. I mean,
Hmm.
where to even start with grief? I mean, yeah,
Well, I think we could start there like we're doing so many other ways right now, Clay, which is just to normalize the hell out of it.
yeah, yeah.
Grief is a thing. It is a real thing. We need to sort of sing this to the rooftops because, given everything we're talking about, the inherent nature of loss in life, We are constantly, if we're really paying attention and honest with ourselves, we're losing things all the time. And if not in
Mm.
ourselves, people through people we know, or just being aware and having a conscience in this world and being aware of genocide here or there. And it's just, you know, and because we're connected, we feel sort of empathetic grief too. So one way or another, that stuff, again, as you open your eyes, you see loss, death everywhere.
Yeah.
Right behind that realization needs to be, okay, well, how do you deal with it? Well, one very important, invaluable way of dealing with that is grieving. You can't pretend, oh, I mean, if you want to just go through this life unattached, unloving, say, well, it doesn't really matter. That comes, that goes, whatever, die. You can go that route. You can love nothing and therefore not experience the pain of losing. I do not recommend that path. Or you can love everything and get really good at losing and get really good at grieving if we have to see it in performative terms. So yeah, so grief is given to you. It's like a metabolic, I like thinking of it as an emotional metabolic process. It's something we need to do to churn this truth in us, this hard truth in us. And we as humans, we want to attach and we want them to be permanent, and they're not. So we're just constantly relearning this. And I wouldn't get down on yourself for like, oh my God, I never mastered loss. No, no, just give yourself the grace of grieving it. Feel it. That's what I would suggest. Because grief will teach you and help you honor the things you're losing. And it will also show you what you still have if you give it time.
Mm.
So it's a very potent force. I think we do a lot of harm by shortchanging grief. I did that myself. I tried to do that myself years ago because grief, I bought into that grief felt like weakness and like moping or, whatever, something lame. No, no one taught me it was absolutely critical and invaluable. And in some ways, a sign of strength, if you ask me. So that is a really important point that is sort of giving the fact that we're living through multiple existential crises. Now is a really good time for society to embrace grief for all the reasons we're saying. So if
Yeah.
from a public health standpoint, if you ask me, if there's one thing, one muscle we could all exercise to make sense of the realities we're living in, it would be grief.
Hmm.
It would be grieving.
Are there ways to exercise that muscle, or like even particular rituals, whether ones you used at the Zen Hospice Center, or things you've done in your own life? I remember someone once telling me that after a breakup, you should like write three things you're grateful for, three things you learned, something else, and then burn the letter. I'm just curious if there's any rituals or things like that you found particularly helpful, or things from other cultures, other countries.
There are absolutely, I mean, there are certainly just tons of rituals around this subject for grieving. Every faith tradition has rituals for grief. But I just haven't mastered that list. I am sort of blissfully agnostic and unaffiliated. And so I don't, in my own life, do not come from a tradition that gives me some rituals, but they exist. And like you referenced, I worked at a Buddhist-inspired hospice for years, and I learned some rituals there. Like the flower ceremony was my favorite. Someone died at Zen Hospice. When the mortuary guys were coming to pick the body up, we would all pause. The body would be rolling out on the deck, and we would all pause, including the funeral home guys there. And they loved coming to Zen Hospice because it was so beautiful. Before they zipped up the body bag, we'd all gather around the body and sprinkle it with flower petals, just to give ourselves this beautiful little image to note this moment in time. It didn't take more than a few seconds sometimes. It was very simple, but it set us up to enter our grief a little differently with this images of flowers and beauty and nature and reality. And in that way, boy, much different from some of the deaths I experienced in traditional hospital settings where it's sterilized, it's on to the next patient. There is no ritual per se. There's no noting. It can feel like you're wondering if even it just happened. So to linger in that residue can be a very beautiful thing to do.
One thing that jumps out to me here is, and reading about you and talking to you before is, and again, this goes back to the sort of abstract, felt, the abstract idea versus felt sense dichotomy. But you've talked beautifully about how one thing you've learned from your patients is just being appreciative of this thing we have here, this like the mystery and wonder, and even hearing you hearing you speak today, like talking about the leaves falling and seeing the bugs, even though they're dead. Like there's a sense of wonder in that, and I think we all want to feel more attuned to the world's wonder, and we all want to be more present. And I know I can speak for myself. I think I can speak for you, and I can speak for a lot of our listeners when I say we're also all like pretty ambitious, and we get
Mm.
very wrapped up in getting things done and striving and getting caught in that sort of slipstream of propulsive energy that's pulling us to the
Yeah.
next thing. I know you're working on a startup right now. That is hard work. That is keeps you
Yeah.
busy. I'm sure there are things you really want to accomplish with it. I'm just wondering how you think about striking that balance and what you've learned about sort of just a like tuning, keeping your radar tuned for wonder, even as things do get busy and chaotic and stressful. Just tuning
Yeah.
back into that sense of like, look at, the fact that we're here is crazy. The chances that we were going to be conceived are basically infinitesimal, and yet here we are. And isn't that amazing? But that's a
Yeah.
hard thing to keep in the forefront of your mind.
It is. Well, it also gets at your last question about ritual. So for me, every morning or most mornings, I try to start the day. I go through my sort of self-critical things that I wake up with, and I brain's getting all gnarly. I usually wake up with usually very negative valence. I usually step outside for a moment, tune into the natural world, and remember and almost ritualize this. Okay, BJ, look, keep your eyes open and patch in to, for me, it's nature, patch in there. And just, it doesn't take long, a couple seconds, and it doesn't bulletproof my day. But to your point, you've just keyed into this bigger reality, and that allows you to frame your day a little different. So as I descend into my little particulars and my idiosyncrasies and the things I really want to happen and the things I want to change, I'm all for that stuff. Again, it's just to keep the context right. So setting that tone in the morning with the context, and then the end of the day often ends for me with very dim lights, music, sometimes sitting outside and doing much the same. At the end of the day, I bookend it. That's just my thing. I mean, whatever. Does it find your own way? But to your point, it's so easy to forget. And perhaps for those of us who are a little more ambitious, maybe extra easy for because we get that focus, which is so powerful too. But the real strength for me comes from the ability to sort of own your lens. You can zoom in and hyper focus, and you can zoom out and see the big picture. And I really recommend any of us, performative or otherwise, learn to do both. So don't forget the other half of that equation. If you're a super trainer focused person, zoom out, and it can be 5 seconds, and just find your way. Look at the night sky. Jesus, to your point, what? We're all on the same planet at the same time in a galaxy that's one of 8 gazillion galaxies. What the fuck are you talking about? It is so ridiculously unlikely. And that's a pretty accessible truth. The night sky alone can give us that thought. And it took this, the time to say that out loud. So
Yeah.
find your way with it. I think it's a super key thing. And also it allows for, like what you said earlier, um, it's really like performance can imply an attachment to outcome. Like I want to win, so I'm attached to winning. Yeah, okay, fine. If that's whatever, if you want to do that, good, take that path. That's what wrenches more out of you, and that's what feels right for you in this world. Great. And this is why I feel so bad for folks who have never lost, because they're gonna at some point. And boy, you learn so much from that. And then you're back to what you said earlier, which is, yeah, you can shoot for winning or whatever the heck that means. Great. And you better really love the process of getting there, because one day you are going to lose. And if your world crashes because you lost, well, that's telling you something. You've been out on a limb that needed to break. So yeah, go for winning. Great. And just pull back and see that winning isn't everything. So hold it lightly, even playfully, this desire to win, this performative thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, completely. And I mean, a few things to say off that. One is if your framing of winning and losing at life is surviving, then we're all going to lose,
Right.
So
Right.
that's one. But no, the
Right.
zoom in, zoom out thing is great. I mean, we talk about that a lot. We've talked about it often in the context of I mean, it's very appropriate right now with the Olympics going on, but in terms of track, specifically athletes who are doing something like decathlon, where all right, I got to zoom in and focus on my long jump. But then when that's over, I got to wait for the next event. Like I got to be able to zoom out. But even if you're just doing one event, if you're doing the 100 meters, like you need to be able to zoom in and really lock in. But it
Yeah.
also helps to be able to zoom out and have perspective and be like, even if I can only say that as someone who's never won a gold medal, but I imagine it would help to zoom out and be like,
Yeah.
even if I lose, my coach is still going to love me, my family's still going to love me, my country hopefully will still going to love me, and realize that like this isn't the end all be all. And I think that ability to zoom
Yes.
in, zoom out is really key for great athletes.
I completely agree. Even if your goal is great performance, it's not just a consolation prize kind of mentality. Actually, I think it will make you stronger, faster, better. And if by some measure, and even if it doesn't, you'll have more fun. You'll be more easy to be around, and you'll have an easier time being around yourself. And you will not be at odds with your reality. If losing is unacceptable to you, I hear folks who kind of coach this sort of losing is unacceptable. Therefore, I'm going to leverage myself to win by any means. Well, I don't know about that route, man. I don't know about that route at all, because what you're doing is you're carving up your reality, you're shortening, you're making your life world smaller, and you're actively courting being at odds with reality. And that's another way of saying unhappiness.
Yes, yeah, not accepting what is for sure. Um, Another parallel here, I think, and I mentioned it to you before we started officially having our conversation, on air conversation, was the idea of play, right? And I think in sport, the more playful you can be in some ways, the better you can perform,
Yeah.
even when you're at the top of your game. And again, a professional athlete might say like, this is no joke, this is my career, but you kind of have a trump card because you're like, I'm bringing playfulness into death. And they kind of, so if they're like, my NBA career is serious, it's like, well, it's not as serious as death, even though it is serious. So I'm curious how you think about, I don't know what advice you have on keeping playfulness very present in your life. You told me about your dog Vermont the first time we spoke, and he
Oh
sounded like
yeah.
a great
Oh
way to do
yeah.
that. But I'm curious how you
Yeah.
think about it these days.
Oh, good memory, Clay. Yeah. Dogs. Vermont was my service dog, and then more recently, Maisie. She died last year. But boy, yeah, being around animals has been her kids, can be a real source of like, they can be such great teachers. So, one thing to say is let's define playfulness a little bit. That word sort of inherently seems unserious, but to your point, I'm very serious about play. If that's possible. And what do I mean by that? To me, the root or the sort of irreducible piece of playfulness has something to do with we do it for its own sake. So it's another way of saying it holds any attachment to outcome pretty loosely. You could say, well, play is a great way to get exercise. So it's a means to an end. Okay, that might be true, but that's a sort of a side effect. I don't, play isn't as fun if we're doing it for effect. If we're just sort of open to whatever's going to happen, you'll watch kids on a playground. It's so fun and goofy, and it's not, and it has its own poignancy. It makes its own magic. It is not a means or just a means to an end. Play is its own, it casts a sort of an attitude or a light or a kind of a climate around an experience that just is another way of saying that we hold the outcome lightly, and I'm doing it for its own sake. So if I love riding my bike, maybe I get really good at it fast and I could win some races, cool. Or, maybe I could just use it for transportation as a means to an end. Great. Those can be also true. But if I really just love the feeling of riding my bike, being on a gyroscope and just, that weird sense of balance, if I really love that for its own sake, then I'm really cooking with gas. Then I'm in this thing completely. It's not contingent on winning, losing, all that stuff. It's a deconditioned space. And that's a kind of a freedom. So back to the definition, I think, of play is anything that we do for its own sake.
Mm.
Uh, And it can be any act. You can bring playfulness to any act. You can bring playfulness to a mortuary, to a morgue. It's just a way of loving what you're doing for its own sake, which is that is about as bulletproof as it gets.
Yeah, I love that. It's easy to make everything instrumental, right? Is something to be used for something else.
Yes,
And
utilitarian or
yeah.
yeah, purpose per se, a narrow notion of purpose it can be powerful but
Mhm.
inadequate.
I was thinking it's harder as we get older just because we are less likely to tolerate being bad at something. And a lot of play is being bad, like not
That
being
might be
skilled.
true. That might be true, but I wonder if I wonder if there's a far side of that as we move as we age, and at some point, notions of performance just have to shift. What's possible out of a
Yeah.
body shifts.
Yeah.
So yes, maybe if you hang around long enough, you will lose that sort of external gauge of success or failure, and then you're cast back into a very playful zone. It's why I think I see a lot of people, of course, of life be very playful in their younger years, get very serious and purpose
Hmm.
driven for their middle years. And then if they're lucky to hang around, see the light at the end of that tunnel and get back to this more childlike state of like everything is just like, wow, even sorrow can have a playfulness to it. Sorrow tells me I'm alive, that I cared, it's like, so anyway, yeah,
Yeah.
this playfulness I think should be accessible all along, is accessible all along the way, but its poignancy goes up as we age.
Hmm. While we're on these parallels between sort of your work and performance, I mean, it's all performance, but I think we seem to be talking a lot about sport because I think there's a lot of parallels there too. And I want to be clear, there's not a one-to-one comparison between like death and sport, but I just think it's interesting that there are some
Mhm.
parallels there. I
Yeah.
just don't want to overstate it. But, you know, a lot of, I think, your work as well, and correct me if I'm wrong, is sort of normalizing the idea of suffering
Mm.
um, in the sense of, I know I've been guilty of this. I can go through life being like, yeah, I don't want any suffering in my life. And then you realize, like, well, who do you think you get out of life without suffering? It's kind of like the thing that happens, We should expand our definition of reality to allow for the normalcy of suffering. And again, there's a parallel in sport where it's like if you're going to go to a hard workout, like you're going to suffer. That's why you're doing the workout. Um, and I guess I'm curious how you talk to people about how to again just expand that idea of our version of reality to allow for suffering or
Yeah.
pain.
Yeah. It's a big question here too, brother. So yes. So one
Full
is
of big questions
there
today.
you are. There you are. Jesus. That's great. So suffering, like every word we're using, like any word, period. They're symbols, right? And you got to get clear what you mean by suffering, what any of us means by suffering. Hear people say things like pain is necessary, suffering optional, or something like that. Um, okay, I get that point of view. That is I don't love that statement. I mean, pain, suffering becomes optional in the same way that any of us can reach enlightenment. Sure.
Yeah.
So like this note the high bar of that because otherwise you end up castigating or unnecessarily vilifying suffering. Like, hey man, suffering's optional. So
Suck it up. Yeah.
if you're suffering, that's on you, dude.
Yeah.
Well, thanks. That's nice. So yeah, so for me, suffering is sort of the gap between the reality I have and the reality I wish for.
Hmm.
There's an emotional, spiritual, physical component. It's much more dynamic than, say, pain or nausea. These have very
Hmm.
specific sort of mechanistic, anatomical phenomena. Where suffering is much more loosey, like losing car keys can be the source of great suffering. All sorts of things, anything can be the source of suffering, depending on your attachment to it. Perhaps I'm getting a little psychobabbly, but maybe you take the point. So find your definition of suffering, then you can say whether or not it's normal for you. But it's telling to me, like I've never met anyone who hasn't suffered. I it is kind of interesting to note, like the first thing that happens when you come out of the womb, if you're healthy, like the good news, like, oh, good news is the baby wailed, like screamed bloody murder as its first act on the planet. That's good news. That's
Yeah.
that's a healthy baby, Like Jesus. Okay, so you've been on this planet for more than a few seconds, you have suffered period. So, so for me, that's just the truth. And I see it in everybody I talk to. So it just is. Now, is there something in there to work with? And yes, I do think there's something to the notion of enlightenment, which I think has something to do with like being connected but not attached. We keep coming around to this point, whether it's outcome related or your process related. It's so you can find your way to not suffering in this life, but it's pretty hard, and you got to go through a lot of suffering to get there anyway. So one way or another, let's call it normal. Now, working with that, I think it's very helpful to distinguish between necessary suffering, the
Mm,
stuff that just happens, versus unnecessary or gratuitous suffering, the ways we actually heap it on ourselves and each other. To me, that's a really important distinction. I think it's a really beautiful way to get through this world, trying to not add to the unnecessary suffering. And that kind of summons an activism. We do generate suffering for ourselves and each other by our unkind words, by being mean, by vilifying parts of ourselves or each other. Being ashamed to be sick is a great gratuitous suffering. Why are we ashamed to go through something natural or normal, etc.? So yeah, there's a lot of work to do, and activism and an advocacy around kind of pushing back on gratuitous suffering. It's all
mm,
over the place. We seem to love causing it. To me, there's something very holy about pushing back on the gratuitous suffering load in the world. And part of, maybe ironically, part of that work includes not getting down on yourself for suffering. Like quit up
mm,
on the shame loop. Suffering happens. If you're a real human being, it's so don't feel like shit for feeling like shit. Stop that cycle. That's the gratuitous part. Accepting your suffering and working with it, learning from it, that'll move you through it. So
mm.
the unnecessary suffering begs a sort of an acceptance, a kind of a love, whereas the gratuitous stuff begs a kind of activism and a change agency in that. So two very different responses, and that's why I think it's helpful to distinguish between the
Yeah.
stuff you can't avoid and the stuff that actually you're actually creating or participating in creating.
Yeah. And so when necessary suffering enters your life, what kind of dialogue do you have with it? Or I'm curious how you actually like allow it in.
That's good. So sometimes in my life, I've had the good fortune of having suffering or problems be so big that there wasn't a question of letting it in. It was just coming
Just
in.
in. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just in.
We're
And
in.
yeah, so and that sucked, and I'm kind of grateful for that because again, what I choose it helped to not have choice.
Yeah.
But now I have a little bit more choice, and so much of what I spend my daily life doing along these lines, just for my own development and trying to keep prying my eyes open, is actually feel what I feel. I've been shocked to learn just as I'm 53 now, and I watch how top heavy I am, how cognitive oriented I am, how much my thoughts lead my life. And that's, it's the world we live in. It's the educational system I was brought up in. It's, okay. But I see its shortcomings now. You can watch some of those techie guys. Just the aspiration is to be completely done with your body. A head in a
Mm.
jar kind of thing. Like, no thanks. I mean, maybe we'll go there. I'll be curious to see what happens. But one way or another, sort of, we're so at war with our failing bodies. We talk about them as failing, for just doing what they do. They die. I think it's enough just to find your way to letting the feeling in at all. Like, so
Mm.
where there's choice, finding some safe place to feel the feeling, I highly recommend it because one of the things I've noticed is after years of castigating my own feelings or ignoring them, they get really quiet. They go away. And then I'm only my thought. And thought's a dead end ultimately. for all the reasons we've been saying. So shit. Like while I have this body, this miraculous thing, this body thing that feels things, like doesn't make a lot of sense. We only have it for for a smidgen of cosmos time. Why wouldn't we delight in what it does, what it gives us? It gives us feelings. So I highly recommend, one way or another with suffering, to learn to let yourself feel it along with everything else, including the joy that comes. Open that aperture. It's there, so you might as well let it in. It's in, so you might as well acknowledge it, you know. Then
Hmm.
you're less likely to get stuck with it too. And you're much more likely to also open up your sensors to other feelings and to really
Mm.
idolize and love having a body that can feel things like even things like pain and sadness, because then you also get the joy and the pleasures too. So I guess my answer to your question, Clay, is find some way to actually feel what the hell you're feeling.
Mm.
I highly recommend it. When I see people in their deathbed who committed to a cognitive life at the expense of all else, those guys have it real hard. They're seeing they're coming to terms with their body really with just moments left to live, and that's where one of the ways I see a ton of regret come in.
Mm. Interesting. Where are other ways? Where are other regrets you see come in?
Yeah, so one way or another, whether it's your feelings or just not daring to be whatever the hell you are, to not feel your feelings while you could, to not listen to that, that recessed piece of yourself, to not celebrate what means to be alive, the awkwardness, the goofiness, the not knowingness, the painfulness, all of it. Those are signs of life. So if you alienate
Mm.
yourself from them, you're not, in a way, you haven't really fully lived. So all sorts of regrets kind of one way or another come back to that notion in my experience.
Mm.
Um, and the things that get in the way, they are shame, embarrassment, pride, an overabundance of those reducing features in life. I still do it all the time. I'm trying to cultivate or curate my experience all the time, be more of this, less of that. But I'm just constantly, I mean, there's some of that self-improvement, but some of that is really just alienating myself from myself.
Mm.
And while you have a self, I'd suggest you delight in it and play with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Self improvement's an interesting one because I think it's something that I think there's an element of self improvement that is all about control and about if I think you and I think you used this great phrase when we were first talking. That's like if I just eat the kale and I have my smoothies, like I can. It goes back to the trying to solve death.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of myself included. Like I have to constantly remind myself, okay, why am I it goes back to the conversation about play as well. It's like, well, why am I running or why am I exercising? Like, am I doing this as a way to try to control? Like, there is something you said about increasing your surface area for luck, right? Like, there's a reason
Yeah.
I don't smoke cigarettes. There's a reason I try to have good cardiovascular health. But it's a
Yeah.
fine line between increasing your surface area for good health and having a high quality of life with like being
Yes.
obsessive about controlling and trying to deny the fact that at any moment I could have one bad checkup and I could have, 6 months to live. And I think that's
Amen.
something I'm always playing with. I think a lot of people who are, healthy and concerned with their well-being are always playing with as well.
Amen. And you're saying some really important things here. And working with death doesn't have to. There's nothing wrong with living longer. There's nothing wrong with pursuing health. That's great, but just be careful. You're pointing to. It's not just the act of exercise or the act of eating well or whatever it is. It is the spirit with which you do that. If it's playful, if you learn to love that kale smoothie, enjoy it, taste it, whatever it is, actually enjoy the things you're doing as then the means that there's a piece that playful, that aesthetic piece where the means and the ends are one and the same. You're not leveraging your experience for this potential future. You're not foregoing your presence to get to this other better future thing. So that's to your point. When you catch yourself trying to hyper control your experience, without somewhere in your day also releasing and pulling back on that lens and getting that sort of agile, the agility with your zooming in and your zooming out and your focus and release, then you're accidentally, if you find yourself trying to use the lever of hating your current situation to will yourself to try harder to get to some better place. Ooh, be careful there, man. You're on borrowed, that's real shaky ground. You might get to that other place you're trying to get to, but I bet you'll get there and be like, well, I'm unsatisfied here too. So that's not doing yourself any favors, you know.
Yes,
So yeah,
completely.
try, sure. And at the end of the day, release and looking, haha, what am I silly? I think I'm gonna live forever with my kale. What am I kidding? What am I kidding? You know, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Just like you're doing. And even that control thing, is there some joy that the Serenity Prayer's got it so good? Yeah, control what you can control. But sometimes we sort of overload our focus. We get sort of we just focus on the things we can control. We spend no time learning to be out of control. That when something comes along and gives us no choice, we're extra fucked.
Hmm.
So yeah, control and yeah, don't control
Mm.
both.
This will be maybe another big one for you, but like it strikes me that palliative care physicians have such different goals than the ordinary health system.
Yep.
Um, Things like comfort and care,
Mhm.
meaning,
Yep.
um, and I think
Yep.
we so often associate health and we associate well-being with just good health, good metabolic health, good cardiovascular health. I'm
Yep.
curious how what you think of as the pillars of good health or well-being that are probably different from that, because I'm sure you see people who are healthy and well even all the way towards the end.
Yep. Absolutely. So here again, health. Take time to define these words for yourself. You know, does health mean perfect blood pressure? And what is perfect anyway? A certain number that we've kind of bought in. There's a certain number it should be, this external gauge, all this stuff. So if you have this very narrow notion of health, which healthcare tends to do, and to your point, thank you for sort of noting how importantly different palliative care is within the context of healthcare, because it's importantly different because we've kind of bought into a narrow, reduced notion of health that it's purely physical, that it's sort of data driven by certain blood pressure numbers or cholesterol levels or whatever else. It's a very narrow definition. For me, so find your own definition. For me, health is I like etymology. So health is the root of wholeness. It just health has to do with being whole. Like so,
Mm,
like we were saying earlier, one way or another, if you're out of step with your reality, if you're isolating yourself from bigger truths, that is inherently unwhole. That is inherently unhealthy. So if wholeness is your bag, well, then that it means that dealing with feeling all your feelings, rolling with the full truth of life, etc. That's where the action is, if you ask me. So, but again, each of us gets to say, define that word for yourself. But in answer to your question, what I might say would be the sort of pillars of health. Well, I think there's one kind of linking, at least maybe one linking phenomenon that is for everything we're talking about, which is to sort of this agility with your lens, zooming in, zooming out,
mm,
this agility with your ego. Yeah, I got an ego. Yeah, I can rule my day, but I'm not just my ego. This relationship to my body. Yeah, I got this body, but I'm not just my body. Find your way to this sort of a healthy skepticism with any framework, any model. Some wise person said all models are wrong. Some are just more useful than others because they're all reductions of some larger truth that they're helping you kind of grasp. Healthcare is loaded with them. So don't confuse our sort of constructs, our made up stuff, with the bigger reality that they're trying to help us digest or comprehend. That to me is a sort of a key element of well-being. And so that's my answer. That is
mm,
sort of
mm.
massive single central pillar to health, if you ask me.
Yeah, I like that. The wholeness is great. Connects with. I feel like that's connects with holy too in some ways. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
Um, Last question here would just be this is maybe kind of a funny one, but I imagine there's a world in which when we normalize death, we can instead of normalizing it, we can elevate it to this pedestal where it has to be a transcendent experience.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Like, And is there something to be said about making death like in terms of normalizing it, just making it like just another Tuesday? Like, by setting it up to have to be a transcendent thing, are we actually creating expectations that then make death even more difficult? You know what I mean?
You are so beautiful, Clay. I love you so much. You ask such good questions and you listen so well, buddy. And the fact that you're in your 30s and thinking this way, feeling these ways, I just gives me hope. I mean, I'm not kidding, man.
I appreciate that. I
You're onto
appreciate that.
some really mature, if you ask me, and awesome. So, right on. This is sort of one of the threats of everything we're talking about. So grateful you brought it back, is especially in the frame of within the frame of performance. If we're not careful, we'll set up our dying to be this performance, this thing to get right, this thing to knock out of the park. What more achievement? Ooh, brother. If we make that mistake, so this is why it's so important to discern between unnecessary and necessary sufferings, etc. Like there's certain things we can change, and there's a lot we can't, and you got to deal with both. Again, if it's great to pull aspirations into your life and therefore into your death too, but please remember the other side of the coin that we've been talking about all along is to hold those outcomes super lightly, even playfully. Yeah, I can wish to have. When I think of my death, I hope to be surrounded by loved ones. I hope to be in a beautiful place. I hope to have said my goodbyes. There's no guarantee I can plan all day and all night, every day of my life to have that death, and there's no telling that that's what's going to actually happen. So yeah, bring your aspirations into it, but hold those aspirations lightly. It's just like the other side of the coin we've been talking about all day today, because otherwise, and I see it all the time, Clay, and it makes me so sad, where people go heading into their final moments are then if they weren't careful, they set up dying as a failure, or a certain
Mm.
kind of dying as the one that they wanted, and they did learn the lesson that it's not just about what I want. And so, yeah, man, be very, very careful as you imagine aspirations into your death. Love those aspirations, see those as these creative enterprise, work towards it, etc. But just like any other performance, if we got to see it through that lens, hold that outcome super lightly, lest you set yourself up to go out of this planet on one grand failure. And does not need to be. We do not need that. We don't need that heading off. We do. That's unfair to yourself.
Yeah.
Don't do that.
Yeah. Well, that's a great place to end, I think. Thank you, BJ. This was wonderful. To the spirit of normalizing death, I appreciate so much that we can talk about this and have it be so full of joy and not morbid at all. And I really appreciate what you said there at the end. And if there's any truth to it, it's about my questions and maturity. It's because of good parents and getting to sit across from people like you and absorb some of your wisdom. So I'm very
Right.
grateful to you for that.
Right on, man. Thank you, Clay. Thank you, buddy. It's so good being with you. I really appreciate you doing this.